Our second session is called Then and Now. Just like the previous session, it will consist of 3 presentations. Each one is 20 minutes each with 10 minutes for questions. If you would like to ask questions of the presenters, you can type them into any of the chats that are available. So this conference is streaming on the saveancientstudies.org website, saveancientstudies.org/virtual-conference, Digital Hammurabi YouTube, SASA's YouTube, SASA Facebook, and SASA Twitch. So in any of those places, you can type a question into the chat and it should get to me, and I'll try to ask it of the speaker during the Q&A time, if there's time. And after the conference is over, all of these videos will be available on SASA's website. And also please consider donating to SASA and Digital Hammurabi because again, these are nonprofits. Okay, our first speaker of this session is Georgina Longley. Dr. Longley lives in Kent, England, and after teaching at university and in school, she now balances her research and writing on classics with being a mum. I pronounced it the way it was written, Dr. Longley. She also keeps a classics blog and creates classics memes on Instagram. She holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford in ancient history, and her thesis focused on the Greek historian Polybius, about whom she is going to be speaking today, and her talk is entitled Polybius's Modern Blueprint. So take it away, Dr. Longley.
Right, I'm just going to share the screen, and hopefully this will work. Has that worked? Can you see the presentation? Let me go.
We can, yeah, we can see. There we go.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Cool. Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Casey, for that introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's been a wonderful conference so far. I've been watching the papers, so thank you very much indeed. So without further ado, away we go. An ancient Greek's modern blueprint, Polybius's approach to religion in his histories. So when the Greek statesman, Polybius of Megalopolis, a member of the Greek Achaean League, a prominent member of the Greek Achaean League, was deported to Rome in 167 BCE, I wonder if he had any idea about the society where he'd be spending the next 17 years of his life. He was suspected of collusion with King Perseus of Macedon against Roman influence in Greece in the recent war with Rome, which lasted for 3 years. Polybius, along with many of his fellow statesmen, were taken to Rome, but he was more fortunate than most. He spent these years in the household of the victorious general in the war, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, tutoring his 2 sons. And if you've not heard of him, you'll certainly have heard of his younger son, Scipio Aemilianus, who sacked Carthage. Stationed with such a prominent family and situated in Rome, Polybius had been placed in a unique position to observe the workings of the society that now had indisputably cast its influence over the Mediterranean, including the Greek world. What he saw impressed him greatly, and he became convinced that the form of the Roman politeia, which I take to mean the organization of the community and the form of its political bodies, I do not translate it constitution as it often is, happy to answer questions on that later. So the politeia, and this was what lay behind the strength and solidarity that enabled Rome to rise to imperial hegemony. His 6th book is dedicated to an account of that politeia, and religion was a key aspect in its workings. Although, sadly, we don't have all of this account. Polybius, from book 5 onwards, Polybius's history has become rather fragmentary. The main passage which now survives in book 6 on religion is arguably one of the most debated passages in the histories. At first glance, it might seem to suggest that Polybius thought that the Romans used religion merely as a tool of popular control, that he takes the approach of a rationalist, a pragmatist, and most probably an atheist. What will become clear from my talk today, I hope, is that I don't think this is a particularly useful way of trying to look at Polybius's views on religions. We can't know what his own personal beliefs were from his work. Moreover, not all have accepted this interpretation, and the passage from book 6 is not the limit of his description and analysis of Roman religion, nor indeed of religion more generally. The famous passage from book 6 cannot be taken in isolation. It requires close re-examination and we need to put it back in the work as a whole to understand exactly what his approach to religion was and why. Now, the conference is entitled Opening Up the Ancient World. And for me, that not only means enabling people to find out more really cool things about the ancient world, but showing why study it matters. And we've already heard some fantastic papers on that today. But Polybius is an author who has proved very influential on modern thinkers, even in the 20th century. For example, Hans Morgenthau, who wrote Politics Among Nations, the international relations theorist, actually classed Polybius as being pretty much the founder of international relations in his exploration of the Romans' rise to power. He is a great author, and although perhaps less well known than his predecessors Herodotus and Thucydides, he is an author who very much speaks to the modern reader. Once when I was still teaching, I used Polybius in a critical thinking session in English, and I slightly cheated by removing all the obvious ancient references. I asked my students to assess his thought, put a rough date on the passage. Without exception, they thought he was relatively modern, Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment at the earliest. When I asked why, my favourite answer was along the following lines. His insight into what makes human beings tick and how their good and bad sides are reflected in society, even in the micro-society of their own school. They got quite a shock when I revealed he was writing in the 150s BC. So I think what I would like to pause at this point to say is that what the students said, Polybius' insight into what human beings tick and judging their good and bad sides and how these are manifest in society is very much where religion fits into his account and approach to history. So today I would like to show you how Polybius' view of religion's role in society and his approach to historical explanation offers an insight into human beings and their communities, and one that still resonates with us today, and perhaps especially now. And I will come back to this in my conclusion. So, to explore the place of religion in Polybius' work and establish the modern relevance of the aspect of his analysis, we will be looking at Polybius' attitude towards religion and worship of the gods, whether the gods play any role in his actual explanation of events, as for example they do in Herodotus, the place of religion in Polybius' Politeia model, Book 6, the place of religion and religious conduct in his judgment and assessment of peoples, and ultimately coming down to looking at the importance of gratitude, respect, reciprocity, and duty in his Polybius' criteria for the good Politeia, and why these are very much what still matter. So first of all, on to Polybius and on religion and religious worship. I shall be looking primarily at evidence from outside Book 6 in this section. Polybius' approach to religion clearly shows traits that are similar to those of his predecessor Thucydides. He is not a fan of slavish or feverish religious worship and the frenetic resorting to prayer and oracles in times of crisis. Following the plague at Athens, Thucydides notes the futility of the frequent prayers and supplications in the temples. With rather more obvious disapproval, he later speaks of divination and oracles which create destructive hope, which is the sort of behaviour people turn to in crisis. That is the end of Book 5. Comparable is the following passage from Polybius, which describes the actions of the Rhodians following the disasters that befell them after the Third Macedonian War. And that is the first slide on the presentation. I shall be reading slightly longer than it is on the slide. Utterly disheartened at how these events were turning out, the Rhodians fell into certain urges and practices that were beyond reason, and they were in a very similar state to those who despair suffering in prolonged diseases. For often, and this is where the quotation comes in, whenever such men do everything for their care in accordance with reason and obey the doctors, but are not able to take a turn for the better, they become thoroughly disheartened with what is happening and feel compelled to give up and to turn to sacrifices and seers and to try every sort of incantation or amulet. And so it was with the Rhodians. Polybius might well be even referencing Thucydides here when he mentions disease. It's remarks as these, such as along with the passage in Book 6, that have led to him being labelled rationalist, pragmatist, and even atheist. However, Disapproval of a way of engaging in religious actions does not equate to skepticism per se. Having a practical approach does not necessarily entail his being an atheist, and it is too modern a mindset, in my opinion, to see an emphasis on reason, a rational approach, as being incompatible with religious belief. The following fragment, which may well have been from Book 6, suggests quite the opposite. To learn sincerity towards the gods is a kind of image of truthfulness towards one another. In other words, sincere honouring of the gods was instrumental in maintaining truthful dealing in relations between people. In Book 6, human reason is what leads to the emergence of the values that foster good relations between people and ruler and ruled to form a good community, or politeia. Now we must turn to whether Polybius attaches any explanation of events to the gods, or whether their role in his histories is something rather different. He did not believe that one should turn too readily for the gods as an explanation, or to Fortune, who is Tyche or Tyche. It is reasonable to include Tyche in this paper because she was worshipped as a goddess in the Hellenistic period, when Polybius was alive, and she has often been viewed as a divine, semi-divine or external force in his work. But for Polybius, as will become clear, it was human agency that was paramount, as for Thucydides. So my first example, looking at the role of the gods, or Tyche, is his account of Scipio Africanus's attack on New Carthage in 209. Having carefully observed how the low tide offered an opportunity to invade, to increase the wavering confidence of his men, Scipio announced that Neptune had shown this to him in a dream. The men were encouraged, and they took New Carthage. But at 10:9, Polybius refutes the notion that the episode demonstrates the actual workings of the god, or indeed of fortune. It was not luck or chance. What it showed was the shrewd mind and strategy of Scipio. On several occasions, Polybius explicitly criticizes those who attribute events to the gods or Tyche. I shall look at two. When describing the depopulation of Greece, Polybius argues that one should only blame the gods and Tyche where it is impossible to discover another cause. And this is slide number 2. But where it is possible to find a cause as a result of which and because of which something occurred, I think it is not necessary to attribute these things to the divine. Again, much earlier in the work, in his second book, when he is describing the success of the Achaean League, he states, "It is clear that it is not fitting to claim that this was down to fortune or chance, for that is a poor explanation. We must rather look for a cause, for without this, it is impossible for anything to be accomplished, both in accordance with reason, and contrary to it." But that said, there are sections where Tyche seems to be more powerful, such as 1.4, where he seems to describe Tyche as bringing about Rome's rise to being master of the Mediterranean. It is a debate that still rages quite furiously in modern scholarship. Wallbank, Paydeck, Richards and Howe are all arraigned on the side of Tyche being an external force, with Raveri and Graeber being a little more sceptical. It has even been suggested that she is simply a rhetorical device to denote chance or the unexpected. But my argument is that it is neither. I take Tyche as being simply a way of referring to unseen events, what is unpredictable, something that an individual could not foresee. Here I agree with Graeber. Tyche is likened to an external force, but is never actually called an external force. And she is likened to an external force when events conspire to bring great success or great disaster, and is prefaced by Horsebear, as if some power were directing the course of events. Tyche is also a way of expressing the inevitable cycle of rise and decline. A passage where Polybius quotes Demetrius of Phaleron on the mutability of human affairs due to fortune has been taken as conclusive evidence for Tyche as a quasi-divine force. But Polybius only mentions Tyche in the quotation. For him, the cycle of rise and fall had rather a different course. And that's, of course, as we will see, was human nature. And illuminating human nature is where the gods fit into his account, as we will come and see. Part of the problem with Tyche is, I believe, that when Polybius was being recorded by Byzantine scholars, they would make collections of his work and quotations on particular themes. And a lot of the quotations on Tyche survive seem to come from these collections of excerpts. So that has perhaps skewed our view of its place in his work. Elsewhere, he says, otherworldly explanations are the recourse of writers who do not think with reason. Really quite condemnatory there. So Polybius takes religion seriously, but to use it as an historical explanation is taking the easy way out. That said, it is part of the good politeia. So we now turn to the place of religion in Polybius's politeia model as represented by his 6th book account of the Roman politeia. So this is the core bit of the passage that has led to people saying Polybius simply sees religion as a way of controlling the masses, the common people. But I'm going to read to you much more of the passage, and you will see why I do not agree with this interpretation. But the most important difference which the Roman state has, and for the better, that is to the Greek states, is their undertaking concerning the gods and religion. And it seems to me that what is a matter of reproach among other peoples is exactly what holds Roman affairs together. I mean, a fear of the divine. It is so dramatically paraded and introduced to such an extent by them in both their public and private lives in the city that no excess is omitted. And it would seem to many to be astonishing. But in my opinion, or it strikes me, they do this for the sake of the masses. So what is Polybius telling us here? Well, you can see, I think, clearly why it's been interpreted as him viewing religion as a tool of socio-political control. And Polybius certainly sees the benefit of the masses being kept in check. He is quite contemptuous elsewhere of them in the histories, blaming them very much for the disastrous assembly that launched his beloved Achaean League into the final war with Rome that saw them destroyed. But where the traditional interpretation misses the point, in my opinion, is the argument that it is religion per se that is being used to rein in the people. The Romans have not thought up their religious system to control the masses, but what Polybius says immediately after this passage is the key. He goes on to describe the Romans' honest dealings with one another, which suggests religious belief is more deeply ingrained in Roman society than mere crowd control. You will recall the theme of honest dealing and religion in the fragment we looked at earlier. This supports the interpretation of Beard, North and Price, and more recently, Driediger Murphy, who says that the passage is better read as evidence for the depth of that elite's own convictions. I agree with this, but I wish to push a little further. I would argue that when Polybius says that the Romans do this for the common people, it's not the institution of religious practice per se, but the very public and dramatic way they do it. They want to communicate the importance of religion to the masses and encourage them to respect it. Cohesion is fostered through public display and collective celebration. And this is consistent with Polybius' description of Roman public ceremony elsewhere. Some of you may be familiar with his dramatic and rather wonderful account of a Roman funeral display, which he then says is precisely to encourage the young and the wider population to admire Roman values and to ascribe to them, have faith in them. So public display and spectacle in religion is how the Romans foster cohesion, not religion per se. Nevertheless, the passage also reveals why religion has an important place in Polybius's view of the good politeia. Reverence of the gods is important. It's also illustrated at book 6 near the start. But where it is traditional and customary to revere the gods, care for parents, respect elders, obey laws, whenever the decision of the majority prevails in such communities as these, this then can be called a democracy. Now, it might seem at first as if Polybius is only applying these traits to democracy. However, this is not the case. What he is listing here are the core values of any good politeia. That is to say, reverence of the gods, care for parents, respect for elders, and obedience to laws. If the politeia is then governed by the people, then it is a democracy. Where a few rule, it is aristocracy, where one governs kingship. The features set down in 6.4 apply to all good politeia. We can therefore conclude that these features are a relevant part of Polybius' assessment and judgment of peoples and individuals elsewhere. Therefore, that their religious attitude and conduct is an equally important reflection of this. So, religious conduct and moral judgment is what I come to now. Oh, my mistake, sorry. At the start of the third book of his histories, Polybius said, "It is necessary that I add to the aforementioned account," i.e. his first two books, where he gives an account of the First Punic War and Greece down to roughly 229 BC. He says, "It is necessary I add to this account of the ensuing choice and action taken by the victors, what sort it was, what it was like, and how it guided their whole dominion. I must also deal with the attitudes and feelings of the different peoples towards those who ruled them. In addition to this, the aims and ambitions which prevailed and gained strength among each of them must be explained in both their private lives and public affairs." So it's not just enough to say Rome won. What did Rome do with their win? What did Rome do with that victory? How did it affect how they were perceived by their, well, not exactly subjects, I don't want to use it, but the people over which their influence extended? This is a very important part of Book 6. If you have a king who then loses the respect of his people because of his conduct, he is changed into a tyrant. So, to truly judge whether a people are good or bad, whether their community is good or bad, one must look at their conduct and how they are received by their people. Success or failure are not sufficient. It is this sort of judgment that for Polybius makes history useful and confers a lesson for future generations. History was considered a highly didactic genre in the ancient world, and it is Polybius who reminds us of this more than any other historian. As will have become clear by now, the attitude to, respect for, and conduct towards the gods and religion form part of Polybius' criteria for making such assessments, and it is one we see applied throughout his work, Book 6, beyond. So I come now to a passage in Book 4. Polybius praises the politeia of the Arcadians and seeks to explain their great reputation among the Greeks for hospitality, humanity, and piety. He contrasts the connivance, who are the only Arcadian people who do not enjoy this reputation. In fact, quite the opposite. Polybius writes, "They outdo the other Greeks in cruelty and contempt of law." That's a bad politeia for a start. Whilst this is clearly hyperbole, Polybius makes a point that for some reason they differ greatly in their conduct from the rest of their fellow Arcadians. Now, the custom that accounts for the good conduct of the rest is music. Musical training begins early and continues up to the age of 30. Among the songs they learn, most celebrate the gods and their own local heroes. Songs are sung at banquets, and even military maneuvers are practiced to these songs. He says they did not do this for pleasure or luxury, but to combat the influence of their harsh climate, temperating their character and instigating good order. Religion is a key part of music, and thus of achieving their praiseworthy piety and humanity. A further example of scrupulous religious conduct, describing the Romans on the eve of another battle with Hannibal, which is quite consistent with what he says in Book 6. He says, All the oracles that existed among them were on everyone's lips. Every temple and house was full of signs and portents, as a result of which sacrifices and supplications of the gods and entreaties took over the city. I know what you're thinking. Hang on, this is very like the Rhodians, isn't it? For in dangerous circumstances, the Romans, out of fear, propitiate the gods and men, and consider nothing to be unfitting or ignoble in accomplishing such deeds at such moments. So this might seem inconsistent at first with Polybius's condemnation of the Rhodians' response as being contrary to reason. But there's a significant difference. The Rhodians turned to such action out of panic and desperation. But according to Polybius, with the Romans, it is an ingrained practice. We're going back to the public display to encourage community participation and cohesion that he mentioned in the book 6 passages we looked at. On the other side of the coin is Philip V of Macedon, who starts well, his conduct is good, and he appears to revere the gods, giving thanks for victories. But his conduct degenerates. In Book 5, he destroys the Aetolian city of Thermus in retaliation for their destruction at Dium, and he does not spare the temples or the statues of the gods. Polybius does not accept this action as justified. Other historians, he notes, have. It was just requital for what the Aetolians did at Dium. But Polybius says, in doing this, Philip dishonors his great ancestors and predecessors by his actions, who, even if they destroyed a city, spared the religious monuments and statues, including Alexander the Great. You'll recall that respect for one's elders was an important feature of the good politeia. Phillips is showing all the sign, therefore, that his rule is not. The example I have for you on the handout of poor religious conduct and respect is Prusias of Bithynia. After conquering Attalus and arriving at Pergamum, he prepared a lavish sacrifice and brought it to the temple of Asclepius. After slaying the victims and obtaining good omens, he then went back to his camp. So far, so good. But then he directed his attacking force against the Nicephorion and destroyed all the temples in the sacred enclosures of the gods and despoiled all the statues of men and the marble images of the gods. A rather interesting and my final example in this section comes in the form of Antiochus Epiphanes. It's actually quite amusing. He seeks to act, when he comes to power, as if he were one of the ordinary people. In effect, he copies the Romans. He dresses up in a white toga and presents himself as though he were a candidate for office, going around the forum at election time, publicly paying tributes to the gods, shaking hands with everybody. Several people think him mad. But it does show that an open display of respect for the gods he saw as a good part of his courting of popularity and of trying to earn the goodwill of the people. We've already met the notion that the relationship between ruler and ruled is an essential part of good social relations in a politeia, and we will explore this shortly in the final section. So just to recap briefly, religion forms a key part of Polybius' judgment of human conduct. But why does it matter so much? Well, along with respect for laws, parents, and elders, it enshrines the key values Polybius extols as part of the good politeia: gratitude, duty, respect, and reciprocity. So we now move to the final section of my talk. The two highest achievements of the human mind are the twin concepts of loyalty and duty. Whenever these twin concepts fall into disrepute, get out of there fast. You may possibly save yourself, but it's too late to save that society. It is doomed. Polybius might well have written the above quotation, but it in fact comes from Robert A. Heinlein's novel Time Enough for Love. But when he talks about the concepts of loyalty and duty as being like a social glue, it is very similar. So I'm going to describe for you now the process by which Polybius believes these moral concepts come into being. In the beginning, people come together for protection and support the strongest member of the group who gives them that protection. Family ties and social relations emerge between members of the group, and this is the birth and beginning of goodness and justice. Children are born and raised, and reverence of their begetters is expected. If one should appear ungrateful, he will injure those who reared him and anger those around who witness this lack of gratitude. This develops because humans have the power of reasoning, unlike other animals. Lack of gratitude comes to be an action they dislike and which they fear incurring themselves. A man who does not thank his rescuer meets with similar disapproval. People who wish to prevent such actions come together and support a ruler who throws his support behind those values. And thus the notion of duty is born, a reciprocal duty. Reason and value thus become the criteria for choosing and respecting leaders, as long as they remain respectful of the values for which he has come to power. But hang on, you say, no mention of gods here. What's this woman on about? Now, it is true, Polybius does not mention the gods directly in this passage, but there is nevertheless a clear connection to the role played by religious conduct in Polybius' assessments of human behaviour. His strong disapproval of the lack of respect for others' religious buildings equates to a lack of respect for religion itself. And we saw at 6.4, reverence of the gods is a key feature of the good politeia. And yes, it is all about human nature, that passage. Religious disrespect reveals human nature's faults, and it is these which for Polybius overturn good politeia and foster hostilities both within and between peoples, as we saw in the case of Philip of Macedon and the Aetolians. I will end this section by exploring a really ghastly example of religious disrespect that is a reflection of bitter internal discord. Not concord, I do apologize, discord. In Sparta, following the death of Cleomenes III, a conspiracy rose to restore the monarchy after Cleomenes had been forced into exile. During a procession of the military, the leaders of the conspiracy killed the ephors who were against the restoration. As if killing them wasn't enough, they killed them at the altar of Athena of the Brazen House, famed for offering sacrosanct refuge to criminals sentenced to death, thus violating the sacrosanctity of the monument. And so to conclude, religion and religious conduct form an important part of Polybius' approach to explaining the events he is recording. But this is what we see is not because he attributes events to any sort of divine agency, but rather because he viewed worship of the gods, observance of established religious practices, and respect for religious buildings as an important part of a good community. Polybius judged politeia according to the conduct of the rulers, and their attitude to religion was one of the criteria by which he assessed this. Respect and gratitude between people are fundamental for society to function well. And this is where the ancient Greeks' modern blueprint comes in. This has not actually changed since 150 BC. And I wonder if this is perhaps particularly relevant now. In a world where we're witnessing struggles of integration within societies, where the very language that we use when thinking about internal cohesion is being questioned, potentially overturned, and the attempt to renegotiate what would make our society comfortable for all. I think Polybius' message of reciprocity, duty, and loyalty continues to resonate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Longley. I think we probably have time for just one question because we're kind of bumping up against the next presenters. So I'll read one for you from the YouTube comments. Didn't the Romans adopt and copy the religious practices of the Greeks? In my opinion, it's not that big of a leap to think that the Romans used religion as a system of control.
Oh, absolutely. There were two parts to that question. I'll deal with the other first. Yes, there was a lot of Greek influence on Roman religion. That's absolutely true. You can see in the equivalents of the gods, Zeus, Jupiter, Athena, Minerva, but they were also very good at incorporating their own own gods from Italy. So there was Etruscan influence as well, their own their own priesthoods. As I said, it wasn't just about Greek influence, although I think you're right. So thank you for that question. It was probably the main influence. And no, you're right. They do use religion as social control, but this idea that that's all it's about for the Romans, I don't think is what Polybius is saying. We might think it, and certainly it's something Cicero talks about in De Natura Deorum. I can't remember which speaker it is now, forgive me. He says, well, I don't know whether I believe it, but it's useful for keeping the mob in the forum in check. So it's certainly something that they were aware of, that they were doing. But I think that Polybius is saying, whilst this is an added benefit, it's not as he sees it, the sole purpose of religion and the displays that they parade before the people.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for your talk. That was really wonderful and interesting. A lot of things that I have not encountered before myself. So I'm interested to learn more about Polybius and his writing.
He's cool. Very Polybius.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this speaking here today. It's been a great conference. Thank you.